Welcome to the Augmented Society Network. I'm going to start by introducing Philippa Mothersill. She is a doctoral candidate in the Object-Based Media Group at the MIT Media Lab, where her research draws from design theory, cognitive psychology, and computer science to understand and enhance creativity, particularly considering how we can move more intuitively and considerately to integrate technology into new tools at a very early phase of their creative process. She's developed many design tools, including the Emotive Modeler CAD tool that allows users to use expressive adjectives to manipulate 3D forms, and the Design Human Creative Prompt tool that provokes new associations between concepts in a user's project. Her work has been presented at international academic and industry conferences, including CHI, the Design Research Society, and the European Academy of Design, and been featured in the press, including Fastco.design and ACM Interactions magazine. Before the Media Lab, Pip worked for 3 years as a product designer for Procter & Gamble, where she led the upstream industrial design of new products by bringing together research, marketing narrative, and functional technology to create the first aesthetically designed functional prototype in a product's development cycle. She holds an M.Eng in aeronautical engineering and a joint MA/MSc degree in industrial design engineering from the Royal College of Art. Pip, you're very welcome. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak.
Oh, pleasure, an absolute pleasure. So let's get stuck right into the questions. Just fascinated in reading what you've done, and I've played with the tools, the ones that are online, and I just find it absolutely fascinating. My question to you really is has this been a specific journey? Are you following a path, or how did you get to where you've got to?
So it has never seemed like a very strategic decision, the path that I have followed. But as I sort of look back, work that I've done 5 years ago, work that I've done 10 years ago, there's definitely threads that come through. And I think a lot of it has been about my tension between sort of the hard sciences, maths, physics that I studied at school, and the art and craft that I also studied at school, but practiced a lot at home as hobbies. And I think that I've slowly been trying to weave my way between those two fields and bring them closer together. And I think that that's probably the guiding trajectory for the decisions that I've made that led me to where I am today.
Fascinating, because that is something that's you could have ended up on either side, I guess. I imagine that your perseverance has had a big impact on the way that you've been able to straddle those two classic areas. I can't imagine that would have happened naturally. So there must be that passion that has enabled you, maybe you're going right to left, not necessarily centrally down the road. There's a passion there that has brought you back to be where you are. I wondered if there's any way of describing that.
Tough question. I think it's definitely not been easy. Being in an interdisciplinary space is always challenging because it's hard to communicate. You're not in one field and you're not in another fields. And one of the skills that I realized when I was working, which I think came from this varied education that I had, was about being a translator. Actually, it probably all comes from my mother, really. She was very passionate about the idea of being a Renaissance woman. So, one story is I remember when I was young, we made a doll's house, but she also taught me how to wire up the electric light bulb in the doll's house as well. So that's sort of, it really does come a lot from my wonderful mother, my wonderful parents, allowing me to explore both of those fields in a very non-judgmental way. I think she as well, she was a computer scientist, but in the days before that, it became very male-dominated field, and so there wasn't any sort of specific genderization of either of those subjects, and that was great, and led me to have the confidence to exist in a very male-dominated environment, but have the confidence to bring subjects and opinions into those technical fields that are not part of the normal conversation, but continue to question some of these dogmas in both of the fields.
And you mentioned being on the edge. That seemed to me to reflect quite well in terms of what you've done in your career. You're pushing the boundary across those two subject areas, which I can absolutely understand as having been difficult. How important is it to you that you're on that edge? You strike me as someone who needs boundaries to push through.
Yeah, so I do like boundaries and constraints, but because it's always something that you can push against. But then one of the things I'm not very good at is ignoring the giant pink elephant that's wandering around the room. I'd be like, what about this thing over here? And I think something that helps my own understanding is by questioning some of these standard approaches to do things, standard assumptions that we're making about certain topics, and then trying to understand how they connect to things in different ways.
I'll assume, but I'm going to need you to explain, with that frame of thinking, and I love we were just previously talking about sort of hiding in plain sight, the things that need to be brought up, the things that need to be discussed. Is it that kind of thinking that led to the emotive modeler?
So the emotive modeler is an interesting one. So one of the things that I experienced when I was working in industry as more of a designer, working with scientists and engineers, is sort of the difference in how our technologies allow different forms of creative expression. So when you use a CAD tool, so a computer-aided design tool like SolidWorks or Rhino, the language that I use to enter in the design to create the 3D model is all numbers. It is all geometry and radii, which is sort of very sort of physically grounded, very sort of binary. And designers often think in poetry. And so I really wanted to be able to have the computational tools that we were using to create a lot of the designs we're making, to be able to speak that more emotive, more expressive, more poetic language that's really relevant in the early stages of the creative process. So that was what led me to create this tool, which is a plugin for Rhino, where you could type an expressive adjective, and then it will manipulate the shape of the 3D model of the object to reflect the sort of the personality of that word in the form. Yeah. So for example, if I typed in friendly, it would create a very rounded, organic shaped surface. Whereas if I typed in something like aggressive, it's a much more negative word, it would create a much more angular, irregular surface of the form. It was about really trying to bridge those two languages, bridge those two worlds in these new computational technologies that we have, which are very much more engineering focused currently.
And the change in the way that you've added those, I'm going to call them emotions, but it's not the right word, into the interface itself is a clear indication of your intent. What I was fascinated by is the math behind the sliders. And you mentioned sharp and angular against smooth and rounded. Can you explain just a bit more about how you allocated those characteristics?
Sure. So there's been a lot of research in design theory from the Bauhaus about what sort of shapes relate to what sort of emotions, what sort of colors, etc. And so I just sort of collected a lot of that research and synthesized it together on some frameworks relating to how emotion can be broken down, and created shape grammar for some of the primary emotions that you can have. So like the really pure emotions such as joy or anger or fear or sadness. And then when you type in a word, you get a sort of a combination of those different emotions which are relevant to the word, but then you have the ability to change it as well. What's interesting though is that the approach I took was actually very limited, and it was actually sort of the limitations I found in that project actually really helped me have a really key pivot in my thinking and approach to sort of computational design tools and the role that they can play in the creative process. You know, my initial approach to this was, I'm going to find the answer. I'm going to find the universal language of emotive form, and then we're going to integrate that into a computer, and then it will just help us create it all. Obviously, that's a load of rubbish. And when I'm doing a lot of studies with the tool, you know, emotions and perception and objects are so subjective. There's some generalizing forms and shapes that you can apply to different positive and negative sides of the emotion spectrum. But it's, you know, to get to a granular, like, this form means this emotion, just impossible. And what was interesting is that when I showed this tool, even in its limited capacity, to expert designers, they actually preferred it, that it had that ambiguity, that it had that imperfection, because it actually created a dialogue. Computer suggesting provoking the designer with a bit like, oh, what do you think of this as a form for something that represents curious or something like that. And even though it wasn't perfect, the designer could still be inspired a lot, because it was like, oh, why did it suggest that? And why do I think it's different? And it then starts that dialogue, which is really interesting. And it's that insight that really sort of, I call it, that was sort of the end of my love affair with rationalism. That really sort of helped me take a new approach to the role that technology can play. You know, we're very much, I feel, in this mode where technology and smart computers just give us the answer. And actually, you know, the big realization was like, well, is there any quote unquote answer? And actually, aren't questions more interesting, especially for the creative process? And so how can technology help us ask more interesting questions?
So rather than, again, accepting what you see or what you perceive, understanding that there is something bigger and very undefinable that exists out there that is still the challenge to you. I love the way you're prompting that via the Design Human Creative prompt tool, but it seems to me that it's something that is allowing for a bigger conversation to happen. It's poking you to say, no, not that. Think something else, think something bigger. Now, I know I've mentioned this before, but I was absolutely struck by Ginny Rometty at this year's CES when she said only 1% of the data that's possible to collect has been collected. From that moment on, my thinking just went massive. But having played with the creative prompt tool, it reminded me that there was a framework, that there are people way more intelligent than me considering all of these huge implications. And the fact that the computer can't pump out answers to questions we can't even form, which kind of leads me on, in a way, I guess. You saw that limitation or that unexpected outcome of the emotive modeler as the end of the love affair, as you mentioned. Those unexpected changes must come into your work. I'm not going to say regularly or daily, because they're precious and rare. What happens when that change occurs? How do you make the most of it? Or do you notice, looking back, that you're just walking past some of the biggest opportunities?
So the most important moments have been these almost 180-degree pivots in my thinking. And they often, at the moment when you're sort of just banging your head on the wall against the same approach, and then it comes in a very, very short moment. Often when just you're describing your work to someone, they'll say the most simple thing. They'll be like, but why? And often, if I don't have a good answer for that question of why, that's when I realize that I'm like, well, why not? And I'll pivot. And that'll give me that'll be the opening for my mind to be like, right, okay, let's go and learn about something different. I was maybe pushing against this idea because I didn't understand it enough. And so I go and take that opportunity to understand something that I was possibly pushing against for the wrong reasons. And often by going and digging down and understanding something, I find the little part of it that is the thing which I can grab onto, the boundary, the constraint that I can then push and critique and build a new approach around and in reaction to. And so yeah, they're just catalysts for me to really dig deeper about a new subject. And often it then goes into, history. I find is incredibly important in informing those new investigations and understanding from a more nuanced point of view all of the complexities of these new subjects.
I'm going to assume then that the MIT Media Lab is the best place for you to be at. Has there been a time when you've just thought, actually, well, you can't answer this, I need to go somewhere else? Or, is the Media Lab the best place for you currently in the way that you can challenge and change and adopt new approaches? I'm assuming it's amazing there.
MIT is a very challenging place to be, which is a good thing and a bad thing. The Media Lab really is a truly interdisciplinary place where there is a lot of space for you there to be overlap. There's obviously, every organization has its quirks that can be frustrating at times. One of the things that has been challenging being at MIT is that obviously it's a technology institute. It is not a design institute. And so that has been the community that I have missed somewhat. And so I've just sort of worked to actually bring that dialogue, those communities to MIT, which I think is hugely important. Understanding how technology and the institutes that develop sort of the future technologies can have a really broad, almost liberal arts understanding of history, of philosophy, of art, and all of that sort of the ambiguity that comes out of those modes of thinking. It's really important for that to influence technology as we move forward, I think. So yeah, it's definitely been a wonderful experience. The community of peers that you have here is just astounding, and you learn so much from them, and that is honestly the best thing about being in this environment. It's incredibly fortunate. I've learned so much. Yeah, it's pushed me to places that I would never have thought I would have gone with my research.
Fantastic. I did refer back to the Design Human Creative Prompt tool, which I have had a play with. I love the emotive modeler. I think it crosses a lot of boundaries and it brings up a lot of aspects of the kinds of conversations I certainly enjoy having. But is there something that you consider to be at this point in time your best achievement?
So I suppose I'm right at the end of my PhD. This is the moment, I suppose, that I could say that. The suite of tools that I've developed, which really put forward this new approach that I'm calling the beyond average approach. So it's about pushing past this very common approach to technology that we have about using quantification and automation and optimization, which at the core of it is, in machine learning, is the algorithm of the cost function, which is actually based on an average. By learning more about the underlying maths behind a lot of this technology, I've sort of grown to critique its relevance when we're using those technologies in the creative process very early on, when we want to think differently and not just go for sort of the expected response. Those are the tools that I've been developing, the Human Design tool that you mentioned, and a Looking Sideways tool, and a low-tech augmented reality tool, Design Daydreams. Yeah, I'm working on as a suite to present people alternatives to very homogenized responses that you get from search queries in, for example, Google or Pinterest or all of these search engines that really rely on sort of very optimizing systems. So that's the beginning of what I hope to be able to share more widely with the world, is this new approach. It's not about rejecting technology. It's about being more mindful about how we just consume all of this, even just 1% of data, creating interfaces and interactions in the digital tools that we use that help us think more subtly about the information that we've presented, to help us to think more critically, help us to think differently.
Wow. Yeah. My immediate thought, as we were talking about earlier, was I go back to William Latham in a different time zone. I'd go back to Benoit Mandelbrot. Do you have somebody that you look to for inspiration? I know you do, but is there someone that you just think, wow, I so enjoyed what she did?
Two people whose approaches I really love. Donald Schoen was a professor in urban planning here at MIT for many decades, and he wrote a very important book called The Reflective Practitioner. It is a really important book that explains the design process, not in a sort of design thinking like do this, then do this, then do this. It's about building a level of expertise and intuition through reflection, not in a sort of meditative sense, but just in a awareness and being open to the provocations that you make, even just through a mistake in a sketch that you've made. I think that has been a very important book for me in developing my own practice and my own creative practice. But it's also, I think, something that is a approach that is increasingly important as we almost give our minds over to the computers. We are stopping reflecting on things. We are just wanting to have answers given directly to us. So it's a really inspiring book and approach that I think that we should all sort of be more mindful of as we develop technology and think about how it reflects our ability to have that sort of reflective practice and growth. There's another book by Kaina Lesky called The Storm of Creativity, which is also a very interesting description of the necessary liminal space that has to exist in the creative process, which again is something I think that we've sort of forgotten about in our age where creativity has almost become synonymous with productivity and an efficiency-based productivity, where I'm like, give me 15 answers before breakfast sort of thing. She talks a lot about the importance of incubation. So there's this, I suppose, this theme between these two authors who I find inspiration by. It's the importance of leaving time and space for reflection in order to get to a more interesting idea, which I think that we, in our age of instant everything, we need to think, also be mindful about how we just need to give ourselves time and space to go for that, conceptual walk in the woods, as it were, when we are trying to think about new ideas, new approaches to the challenges that we have today.
Great. So we've talked a lot about what you do in your career. I'm absolutely fascinated to know what you do when you stop doing this.
I'm doing a PhD, so not much else.
You don't stop doing this.
Sounds very boring, but I love cooking and I love being fluid and experimental, but it's also shopping has become an interesting multi-sensory experience as well, because I pick up one thing and I'm like, oh, what goes well with this, and then go and smell it, and it becomes a sort of a creative experience in itself. One of my favorite cooking books is not actually a recipe book. It's called The Flavor Thesaurus, and it cross-references all different flavors together. It's a fun book if you know how to construct a meal but want to have some interesting inspiration for, like, I want to try some new flavors.
And I'm sure you read up the work that IBM were doing with the IBM chef.
I tried it and I couldn't get it to work very much. I think it's interesting because it does reflect a lot of the practice that I do. And I'll go and look at 4 different recipes on the internet to find something. So I think that is something that is interesting. So actually, what is funny is, like, as I say, all of the threads come together. I often use cooking as an analogy for some of the limitations of the very binary nature of computing, because it's like when you're making a stew, well, you chop up all of your ingredients and then you stir them together and then you taste it as it's being cooked. Very early on, it's still just tastes of different ingredients, but then there's that moment in the cooking where everything synthesizes together and creates a flavor which is greater than the sum of its parts. And I feel that that's sort of a important analogy for the role that humans play in synthesizing information together in new ways, is that greater than the sum of its parts station, which I think that just through the nature of computing might not be as effective. So yeah, maybe that's why I'm also excited about cooking and my creative cooking process at the minute. It's all just a big bundled mess at the minute.
And carefully woven into what I imagine is your 1 hour off at this stage in your PhD, because it must absolutely consume everything. You went back to the kind of what I'm seeing as a thread, and you mentioned threads and when things come together. One question I had for you is, just once or twice in my career, I've had a moment where suddenly something absolutely makes sense. Something comes searingly into view. Can you explain one of those times?
I spoke briefly about it before, but that moment when I was very much anti-AI playing a role in the creative process, and then when someone asked me, but why not? I was like, okay, fine. I'm going to go find out about and do some learning myself. And so I took some courses in machine learning. It was then when I was going back to the very baseline of, oh, so that's the equation that determines a lot of the other stuff. That was that moment where going down to the very core of something made me sort of basically have an understanding or a clearer description of sort of the intuitive feeling that I had about why something didn't feel quite right. And it's often that moment that was interesting. I had another one where I was astounded at myself, and it was I was reading an article about pollution in London, air pollution in London, and how we'd already reached maximum amounts for the year in February or something. There was listing off a load of the reasons for it, increased Uber cars and services and, delivery services. But one of the things that they also kind of almost just wrote about in a half-hearted way was, instant delivery services. And it was that moment that I hadn't connected the dots in sort of the larger systems thinking about every time I push send me something on Amazon Prime, which sends it to me in a day, 2 days. Yeah. I'm essentially putting another van on the road to do that. It was that moment where I was really revealed a lot about, the butterfly effect. I was thinking and how these technologies having a more lateral thinking approach to how we use these technologies, about how you would think that just clicking a button on your computer relates to air pollution in London, really made me to think a lot more about potential bigger effects of the work that I'm doing, about integrating reflection and critical thought into the digital technologies that we're using, helping us build that muscle. Hopefully thinking about how that approach could also help us think in a more systems level way, and therefore understand better the consequences of some of the actions that we take and how they affect things that we never thought that they would affect.
So you had a huge visualization of the impact that pressing that one innocuous button had. Now, you're a fellow of the RSA. How long have you been a fellow? What drew you to the organisation, and what drew you towards the Augmented Society Network?
So I've been a fellow for about 2 years now. But I've known about the Royal Society for a long time. So I'm from the UK originally, but it seemed to be, sort of a less accessible society for some reason when I was in the UK. And then coming to the States, I think maybe because it's younger and a smaller community, everyone's much more embracing of inviting each other to be a part of the community. And so yes, the irony is that I became a fellow when I moved to the United States. It's always fascinated me, I actually spent my first afternoon in RSA House a few weeks ago, and had all of those conversations where I'm like, oh yeah, that's why I want to be part of this community. It was, went from conversations that went from science, went from art to psychology to social change, and really that feeling of the polymath feeling, and which definitely is the way that I think I appreciate having that diversity of topic. Because I think the interesting solutions come in between those fields, those boundaries. And then, the Augmented Society Network is really interesting. I've had some really interesting conversations with your co-founder, Jonathan, led me to want to participate, but specifically about I was really intrigued about the title. So as a tool maker now, I've always been interested in the etymology of tools, the history of tools. A tool is anything that has the ability to augment us, basically, to augment our physical abilities, to augment our cognitive abilities, our social abilities, our creative abilities. I think that's something that I find very interesting. And when it comes to augmented society, obviously something that I'm very passionate about is augmenting our creative abilities in society, and then how that can potentially have a greater effect on social aspects that we have, on the impact of technology in our society. So that was something that I was really interested that the RSA was going to be talking about.
One of my heroes is Tim Berners-Lee. One of our big pieces of work is to look at policy for a future that none of us understand. And something that the World Wide Web Consortium did really well, I thought, and something that I've tried to keep with me is never to name a piece of software, never to anchor yourself in a specific period of time, to ensure that what you're saying is applicable to a number of areas and a number of attitudes or impressions of something. And Jonathan and I thought about it long and hard, and originally it was artificial intelligence, and I said, well, do you know what, I'm going to get bored of that at some point. What's bigger than that? What's wider than that? What gives us the ability to do a full view all the way back to even, the discovery of fire and flint, through to inhabiting another planet? It kind of settled with that title, so I'm very glad that you saw that as something that attracted you. I'm going to try and sort of draw us to a close here. That's something I've been fascinated by, and I know lots of people have. When I was at art college very many years ago, the conversation, the classic debate was art versus craft, the sublime versus the useful. What's your debate? Where's your context?
So the irony is that I think it's probably binary versus non-binary.
I love it. I love it.
I know. Getting meta about the whole question.
Go for it.
Yeah, and I think that sort of the background to that is that it questions the whole approach to truth that we have right now. I think that we've got to the point where we think that we can at some point know everything. We don't know everything, but we can figure it out at some point. And I think that is it's a non-ending journey in my understanding. So this is sort of a bigger, more sort of philosophical motivation to my work is sort of pushing back on this definition that we have of this is the quote unquote truth. Truth is more momentary. Being able to have a more continuous, non-binary understanding of subjects, truth, is really important for us to continue progressing in very different ways, different approaches. So yes, that's my debate. I think it's complex. What are the driving forces for a lot of these things? I think we've got to think much more. Scientists and researchers and artists want to sort of stay in the purity of research and questions and exploration. But you mentioned policy. That has a much bigger effect. If we talk about the many large organizations who are basically driving a lot of this technological force, the Googles, Facebooks, Apples of the world, what are their business models? Why are they making the choices that they're making? How can we start presenting different approaches which can create a sort of a more plural understanding of the role of technology in our future?
Wow, yeah, thank you. I'm going to wrap up there. That was an absolutely phenomenal conversation. This will keep me going for the whole week. Just fired up so many things. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and I can't wait to see what you bring to the Augmented Society Network. Mothersill, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Zoe.